I'll be very honest with you, and I will tell you that this choosing to focus on my native region, on Banat, is something very new for me, in that I only started thinking in an academic way about that region once I moved to Vienna. Moving here, having to cut away roots that I had grown for 23 years in Hungary, was a traumatic experience, especially since it happened in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And I was really afraid of how I was going to feel in a completely strange environment. To my enormous surprise, I discovered that I am at home. I am at home because of the Habsburgs and because of what they did to my home region, to Banat. The way in which they shaped the space, the way in which they shaped the language, the way in which they shaped the traditions, the way in which they created an identity, a regional identity, one of the most successful cases of such creation in Romania, which I am very proud to share with those who belong to the same region. So I thought that doing research on my home away from home, as it were, would help me feel at home here. And I can say that so far it's going very well, especially because Vienna, as the capital of the empire that used to administer that space, is a wonderful place to find sources, is a wonderful place to find expertise, and is a wonderful place to find words from your own home dialect spoken at the marketplace when you go there. This is one of the amazing experiences that helped me feel at home here. I will start today with a brief introduction to Banat, because I'm not sure, I shouldn't assume that everybody is familiar with what that space is. The Banat is today a province, or was organized as a province, taking advantage of its natural borders. At the beginning of the 18th century, when the Habsburg authorities, who had just recovered it from the Ottomans, decided to organize it separately and govern it directly from Vienna, so give it a very special status, they took advantage of the fact that to the north, it's bordered by the river Mureș or Maros, by the river Tisa to the west, by the Danube in the south, and by mountains that separate it from Transylvania and Wallachia to the east. So this allowed them to create a very visibly distinct entity from the ones surrounding it, with borders that were very well defined. These borders, of course, did not remain untouched, as one could expect in this part of the world. Both the world wars and some other things contributed to the fact that today, what used to be once a roughly square-shaped province is divided in three parts. The biggest part of them is now part of Romania. A smaller part is part of Serbia, and a very tiny bit up here in the corner is part of Hungary. All this happened after 1920. The space is interesting to talk about because it is an example of a space that was created in a place where there was no entity. If you look at the maps of medieval Hungary, and if you look at the administrative organization of medieval Hungary, there is no Banat to talk about. There is no single space. We have a space which is broken into pieces, several counties, the county of Keve or Cuvin, Torontal, Chanad, Chenad, the southern part of it, the southern part of the county of Arad, the county of Temes or Timiș, and the county of Kroșo or Karaș, plus a very mysterious administrative entity, the Banate of Severin or Sörin, which would ultimately give its name to the whole province, but which in the Middle Ages was not an identifiable unit on the map. It was the name of an administrative structure that sometimes overlapped with parts of the of Temes County. So we start from here. There is absolutely no unity to the space to speak of in terms of administration, and more importantly, in terms of identity of the populations living there. The population must have been mixed, even though there are very few sources from which we can reconstruct it. But it's doubtful that they shared any regional identity, as all the people who live there today do. Yeah, I will come to this in a moment. After the fall of the Hungarian kingdom and its subsequent breakup, the province itself was split. A large part of it, the one that you see here with red borders, was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, and it became the eyalet of Timișoara. That is to say, the largest urban settlement in the area. A bit of the province, the mountainous bit to the east, which in the later Middle Ages, starting from the middle of the 15th century, had acquired a sort of legal autonomy in the shape of 8 privileged Wallachian districts that formed a sort of territorial autonomy there, managed to negotiate with the Ottoman authorities and were not occupied, were not directly, were incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, and were not organized as an Ottoman administrative unit, but remained part of Transylvania across the border. They managed to do so between 1552 and 1658, so almost for 100 years, until they had to give up and they were occupied, but for a very brief period. And then at the beginning of the 18th century, the Habsburg armies marched and conquered the whole province, marched triumphantly, fought a series of wars in the province, and reconquered all this space, plus a bit of it south of the Danube, which you can see on this map, which was initially under the Habsburg control. And it was a momentous decision of the authorities here to make tabula rasa, to disregard any form of previous administrative organization in the area, and to create a new province, the Banat as we know it today, and to call it Banat. This became the Banat of Temesvar or Temesvar, and in time it lost the Temesvar bit, which referred to its capital, and started to be called simply Banat. We cannot talk about Banat before the arrival of the Habsburgs as a name for the entire province. It's only after 1716, when the Habsburg armies take over the province, that we can start talking about that. And this is really puzzling, because if you go to Romania today, and the linguists did this in the field, this is the one province where everybody whom you ask will clearly be able to tell you that they are Bănățeni, people from Banat, with a word, Bănățan, which expresses the regional identity that could not have existed in the local varieties of Romania before the beginning of the 18th century, when the province itself was created. So the Habsburg administration is directly responsible for the fact that now, when I speak my dialect, I have a word to define what I am and where I come from, which I share with everybody who belongs to this particular space. This is an extremely successful exercise in modern identity building. And it's one that succeeded spectacularly, especially because the Habsburgs did not govern directly the province, but for 70 years, from 1716 until 1778, where the province, with the exception of its border areas, which were reorganized as a military border, was reincorporated into the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Banat disappeared as a concept officially. Hungarian authorities, which were deeply resentful of the fact that in 1716, the Habsburgs did not allow them back to govern these territories, did not give back any lands owned by any member of the previous aristocracy, did not allow the re-establishment of ecclesiastical structures, medieval ones, that were not directly under their control. So the Hungarian establishment was so resentful of this that they decided to forget the name. And if you look at Hungarian historiography and the public discourse in the second half of especially during the 19th century, Bánság, the Hungarian name for Banat or Banat, is a term you do not use if you are a good Hungarian. You speak of Dél-Magyarország, southern Hungary, and the parts of southern Hungary. And this becomes a bone of contention at some point, because of course, the historians writing in German continue to use it proudly, especially in order to emphasize the fact that it was the creation of the Habsburg house. Today, if you do an opinion poll among medievalists who write about the area, you find immediately what their ideological allegiances are, based on whether they accept to talk about Banat within scare quotes or in any other way during the medieval period, or they say, no, that's an anachronism. We don't use that term before 1716, and we try to find other names for the area. There were no other names for the area. Some Hungarian historians call it Temesköz, but that strictly refers to the central bit which is in between the two rivers called Temes in this, and did never refer to the entire space there. So as you see, I'm talking about a palimpsest here, an identitarian palimpsest, where several layers of influence in terms of power and languages of power that interacted with the languages of the people in the field contributed to creating a multi-layered identity, which today, at least from the point of view of the Romanian speakers there, appears very unitary, very coherent. Everybody is a Bănețan, as it were. Unfortunately, there are a few speakers of other languages left in the area because of the various changes. But before 1920, you can see from this map, which was created by a Hungarian geographer, that the space was divided between several ethnic groups. In red here are the Romanians. Then you have Germans and Serbians, which confusingly on this map are all some nuance of yellow, and this was done on purpose. But there are also Catholic Bulgarians who settled in the area at the beginning of the 18th century, brought by the Habsburgs. And there are Slavic speakers, the Karasovans, who were there since at least the 15th century. And then there are strong Serbian communities along the Danube there. Okay, so I will not insist very much before I get into the nitty-gritty of the things. I just want to show you how difficult it is to define an identity for the area. On this small map, you see the borders of Banat as they were, superimposed on a map of a physical map of the area. Next to it, the larger map is my attempt to trace the distinctive linguistic features that define the varieties of Romanian spoken in the area, which can be called Banation or Bănețene, as we would call them today. As you can see, not all of these lines can be superimposed on each other. And there is a distinction between features that appear in a core region that are shared by all the speakers. There are some features that do not occur on the territory defined as Banat. You can see here, none of this is covered because there are no Romanian speakers in that part. But importantly, linguistically, the Banat overspills its borders. There is a part of northeastern Serbia where the varieties spoken by the Romanians who live there are clearly Banat varieties of Romania. So they speak the same dialect that I do at home. I come from somewhere here in the center of this map. It also spills north of the river Mureș, and it also spills into Transylvania proper in this side. So there is a lack of, this will take a while. This is a huge map. They'll be able to meet, right. So there is a discrepancy between the linguistic Banat and the identitarian Banat. People who will define themselves as Bănețeni, coming from Banat, are only those living in the historical borders of Banat. even if they speak the same way that we speak, as soon as you cross these former borders and you ask them to define with one term all the people living in the area, it will not even cross their minds to use the ethnonym Banațan to define them. They will have different identities north of the River Mureș, east here. All of them are micro-regional identities. The only space that has caught this particular identitarian construct, that is to say, the only place where speakers will define themselves as Banațeni, from Banat, Banatians, if you want, is the one that overlaps with the former borders of the province, that is with the borders of the Habsburg province as it was defined. That's why I refer to this as an amazingly successful exercise in creating an identity which did not exist before the Habsburg administration came there. Okay. Now, very quickly, the variety of Romanian that is spoken in the area, the one that's my native language, is officially described by Romanian linguists either as a subdialect or as a grai, speech, as it were. This is purely a political definition that connotates language and dialect in a structure of power in order to privilege the national standard, the national language. This is spoken today by an undetermined number of speakers, mainly on the territory of Banat, the province created by the Habsburg administration, as I said, within these natural borders, and which has been divided since 1920. There is no specific name for the language variety. So if you ask me, what do you speak? We do not have a specific word, although some speakers will tell you that they speak Banațenește, that is to say, in the fashion of Banat. This is an adverb, as it were, yeah? But not everybody will use this. There is no standardized spelling. I use my own spelling, which I made from various sources. But importantly, this is the only Romanian linguistic variety, regional, which has its own literary standard. Because of this dapper gentleman who started writing poetry in dialect in 1896 and created a very alive tradition of writing poetry in dialect, which has contributed significantly to cementing the identity of the people living in the area. If you grow up as I did there, at the end of the year, you will have a school festivity where people will recite his poems, will dress up in full costumes and will recite his poems. I had the honor several times. And these are verses that everybody knows in the area, that have become part of jokes, that have become part of expressions that are shared with the members of the speech community. So, as I said, my dialect comes from the center. I use my own spelling of it, and those of you who follow me on Twitter could see that I occasionally post tweets in Banatian, as it were, driving Google Translate absolutely insane, because it cannot make sense of what language this is. As I said, the identitarian expression in the area is extremely strong even today. And one way of doing this has been, one such expression has become a proverb, which you can buy on stickers. I have one at home. This says, I am proud to be a Banatian, as it were, using a form of to be, I am, which only exists in the area. Mis, for us, is not I am, but to myself I am, with the form of the pronoun. I am to myself, I exist to myself. And this, again, is something specific to the area. So I've been telling you these to give you an idea, of the strong linguistic identity that we can find today in the area. However, if we start to dig a little bit into the history, and especially the linguistic history of the area, we will discover that this kind of unity, as it were, as we find it today, Okay. Share this. So this linguistic unity is a recent phenomenon. As soon as you start digging into the linguistic material, as I have done recently since I started looking at the history of the dialect, and that's one of my main projects now, you discover all the components that went into making it. The history of the region has sedimented into the linguistic history that you can write today. If you start exploring the local variety of Romanian, you will be able to tell, just by looking at some of the words and some of the things that you find in there, a large part of the brief history that I've told you before. The memory of borders is still alive today, in the way in which certain words circulate in certain areas but do not circulate in other areas. The memory of the borders and the memory of the places and the memory of the languages that are no longer spoken there. Especially important are those linguistic features that tell you what kind of stratified and hierarchic multilingualisms existed at points in the history of the region. Multilingualism today is a very sexy concept because it makes you look very modern as soon as you can present yourself or the place where you come from as multilingual. People start associating this with the idea of tolerance, interconfessionality, modernity, lack of conflict, and all that. Historical multilingualisms are not this kind of modern multilingualism that is characterized by an enormous tolerance, equality, openness of this kind. Historical multilingualisms are characterized by very well-defined hierarchical structures of power. And you can usually reconstruct this hierarchy of power, and you can usually identify which one of the languages in the area was the language of power by looking at the way in which the other languages, the other linguistic varieties interacted with it, borrowed from it, mimicked it. And this is something that I try to illustrate here today. Hopefully I will be able to do so without boring you too much. I can start with the names. For the early period, the only source, sometimes the only written source, are names of people and names of places. We do not have any other information because at that early stage, the hierarchy, the multilingual hierarchy that I was talking about, is dominated by Latin. Latin is the only language of literacy, the only language in which you write things. If you write things in other languages, if you give them written form, it's because of legal concerns. If you establish the boundaries of a property, you have to specify very clearly what the places on the boundaries or what the signs on the boundaries are called. And sometimes that means reproducing words from the vernacular there. Also, you need to know how certain people are called if you define specific relations between them. So then names from the vernacular will seep into the written record, which is predominantly in the language of power, and that is Latin. Now, modern historians have a tendency to abuse this fact because these are the only available textual sources, that is to say, names of people and names of places. They tend to misuse them in order to write histories that rely on only this kind of material, but with very simplistic assumptions. If the name looks Hungarian, its bearer must have been a Hungarian. Not just a speaker of Hungarian, but a Hungarian. That is to say, must have had an identity, a Hungarian identity, with everything that goes with this. If the name looks Romanian, then of course its bearer must have been Romanian. If the name looks Slavic, then you're in trouble because there were several Slavic, several groups of Slavic speakers intersecting in the area, and it becomes a matter of some refined analysis to try and figure out whether these are Bulgarians, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, or who knows, maybe some autochthonous Slavs who managed to survive all the invasions that went through that space and all that. Now, this way of writing history was very popular. And unfortunately, it still is very popular because it allows you to write very simple, very clear equations. This place, first mentioned 1007, with this form of the name, recognizably Hungarian, its population must have been Hungarian. Therefore, we can simply draw it on a map with a nice color, with a nice symbol, saying this is a Hungarian area. And if you look at the way in which the history of Banat and of some of the contested territories between Romania and Hungary was written, you will find that ultimately, for many historians, this guy is the source of their information and of their maps. He was a Hungarian linguist, István Knieża, of Slovak origin, who was a very good Slavist, so he was a specialist in Slavic languages, and who, before the Second World War, around 1939, when the issue of revising the borders of Hungary and of the neighboring states in order to redress the perceived injustice of the Treaties of Trianon that broke up historical Hungary, a lot of literature was written, historical literature that tried to show that, of course, we are the ones who should have that territory back, because if you look at it in the 11th century, you will find that the majority of our people were already there in the 11th century, which is mind-boggling. Because for 11th century Hungary, we have a handful of sources, written sources. And they certainly do not tell you what the ethnicity of specific people living in a specific area was. So how did he go about producing I seem to have left out precisely the map that I wanted to show you. A map similar to this one. He has a map which he published in his in the book that I mentioned here. The peoples of Hungary in the 11th century. He has a very nicely colored map which shows you exactly where each ethnic group was, which is a remarkable feat, again, because we do not have any data of this kind. He did it exclusively by analyzing names of places, and occasionally names of people, and occasionally names of waters, and occasionally names of mountains that appear in the early sources. By drawing this very simplistic equation, linguistic form equals ethnic identity. So if the place has a Hungarian form, then obviously the ones who named it, the name giver, fascinating name giver, must have been Hungarian. Therefore, that territory on the map can safely be colored in our colors, as it were. István Knieża was not the only one who engaged in such games. On the Romanian side, obviously, you had something very similar. A scholar called Nicolae Drăganu from Transylvania, who, however, did not produce a map, but he wrote an entire book called Romanians during the 9th to 14th century on the basis of toponymics and onomastics. And he managed the really enviable performance of finding Romanians almost under every single stone and behind every single bush from the territory of Romania proper all the way into Western Hungary of today, by interpreting names of places and names of people. This is extremely problematic, but it was a shared way of dealing with things. Unfortunately, one which is perpetuated even today, because both works became a sort of holy grails for, a sort of holy books for historians and for linguists. For instance, this very good treatise on the history of Hungarian language, published in 2003, simply reprints Knieża's map, ethnic map of the 11th century, with one single change. It no longer says Hungary's peoples in the 11th century, but now has switched to Hungary's languages in the 11th century, acknowledging somewhat that guessing people's ethnicity from the forms of their names is not as easy as it might seem at first glance. The president of the Romanian Academy of Sciences, a medievalist, Ion Aurel Pop, who doesn't work with maps when it comes to these things, likes lists of names, which he baptizes in common ceremonies in his books. He simply takes names of people and declares them to be Romanians, even though the form of their names has nothing even remotely linguistically Romanian about it. And then, of course, on the basis of that, he can find Romanians in the 11th century almost everywhere in Transylvania, which proves that by the time Hungarians came there, that was a safely Romanian space. This is done because this manner of working ignores something that linguists have already become very painfully aware of, specifically the fact that the linguistic form of a name tells you nothing about the ethnicity or the identity of the person who bears it. And this can be very visible, can become very visible if you keep into account, if you apply a processual understanding to the sources. The types of historical interpretation that I mentioned before operate with the simple assumption that if it's in the source, it's safe. And they look only at the form as attested in the source. Rarely ask the question, how was that source produced? For instance, we have an example here of an order of the Hungarian king on the 21st of December, 1506, who orders the canons, one of the canons of the chapter of Đakovo in Croatia, very close to the border with Bosnia, to go all the way to Lugoj in Romania, in Banat, some 350 kilometers, in order to walk on the boundaries of the property that belonged to the castle there, and then write a report to him describing the boundaries, on the basis of which he will issue a deed of property to somebody who asked him to have this procedure done. Now imagine a Croatian speaking member of the local chapter going all the way to Lugoj and trying to make sense of the names of places that he hears as they walk on the boundaries there, which are not necessarily Hungarian, which somebody might be translating for him into Latin from Hungarian, but we don't know, which might be given to him in Romanian and then translated through two different interpreters until he gets them to write them down in whatever form he writes them down. Because this is how this document will come about. There are no archives on which he can rely once he gets there to do this. Unfortunately, we do not know how the names of the places look like, because the only thing we have is the order of the king. So we do not have the final product. But it's important to remember that the names are just the final product of a very long process where multiple linguistic filters can intervene in the linguistic interaction, in the transmission of the data from one language to the other, and a lot can change. I have another example for you today. This is one of my favorites. This has to do with the chapter of Arad. The members are asked to go all the way down to Belgrade, near Belgrade, to introduce the members of the Hunyadi family into the possession of a property that had a gold mine. Now the place is called, very appropriately, Rudista, or Rudistia, or Rudiște, or Rudiste. God knows what the form would have been. It's very difficult to guess from the form that survives in the Hungarian document, in the Latin document issued by the Hungarian authorities. So they did go all the way down there. We're talking about roughly 300 kilometers of travel all the way down there. We are more fortunate because in this case, we know who was supposed to take part in the whole, in the administration of the whole business. A local man called Johannes Bach de Berend, he was a member of a noble family from roughly the area of Banat, is supposed to be the representative of the king. He's supposed to ensure that things go smoothly there. And the person delegated by the chapter is a friar, is a man called Jacobus de Tervar, who is, to judge at least by the fact that he comes from this place, probably a Hungarian speaker. The interesting things happen when we get the list of the people, of the neighbors who showed up during the ceremony and whose testimony needed to be recorded, because if any of them said, no, I don't want these people to get this piece of land, that would have led to further litigation. And these people are somebody called Gregorius Olach, who is the representative of George, the despot of Serbia, of Rascia, so he's an important guy called Olach. Yeah, he has a surname that indicates that somebody in that family could have been a Romanian or a speaker of some Romance language, judging by the name itself. Then we have somebody not identified further called Elește Deac. This was probably an intellectual who was able to read and write and who came from the properties of Belgrade, somewhere in the area. Then the interesting things start happening. An individual called Kalonic, of whom we know nothing. Somebody called Radostava, which looks suspicious because this looks like a feminine name. And the presence of a woman in that particular context is really surprising. And then we have a Nikolaus, who is identified as a Serbian voivode, and a Radic, who is also identified as a Serbian voivode. Looking at this, traditional historiography will simply give you a list of these people who are attested in this area. But I ask myself, how can this name Radostava appear in the final form of the document? Is it the name of a woman, as its Slavic form might indicate? Or could it be that it's the name of a guy called Radoslav, inflected in accusative in Serbian, with a scribe who misread a L for a T and came up with this form? Before rushing, my conclusion to this is that before rushing to assign identity and ethnicity to names such as these, we need to ask, how did they end up like this? What could linguistically explain their form in which they survive in the documents? And you will find out, as I did, that once you start looking at all these details, the certainly Romanian, certainly Hungarian, certainly Serbian, certainly Croatian, certainly Bosnian, certainly whatever, numbers start to diminish because they will start to be surrounded by all kinds of question marks there. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but let me show you something that I wanted to start with this last time because the lecture was supposed to be given on Valentine's Day. So I had prepared a nice slide about a wedding, a famous wedding between Georg Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach and Beatrice de Frangepan, who were married in Dula on the 21st of January, 1509, both of them at romantic ages. She was 25, he was, I think, 23 at the time. Unfortunately, this was not a wedding that would last for very long because she was dead already slightly more than a year later in March 1510. And he didn't wait for a long time because on the 22nd of March, he already asked the Hungarian king to issue him deeds of property for all the estates of the Hunyadi family. She had been the last owner of them. So on that day, he became the master of a lot of Hungary, as you can see here on this map, among other things of a part of Banat. And from this part of Banat, because of him, Georg von Brandenburg is a modern man. He arrives in Hungary with a very specific idea about how you run your estates. He brings a literate mentality into the place, and he wants everything put on paper. When he hires administrators for various properties, he hires them for a year, and he makes contracts between himself and the administrators where their duties are clearly specified. He requires detailed lists of the incomes to be expected from here, there, and the other place. And for the first, this is one of the best documented estates in the history of medieval Hungary, because fortunately, most of these documents did not stay in place, but were sent either to Buda, where he was staying for a long time, from where they ended up in the castle of the family in Germany. And since in the 19th century, when the Hungarian authorities were offered to buy most of this archive, they went for the nice parchments and charters and donations and spectacular pieces, and didn't want all this crap, that administrative crap that remained there. It's still preserved in the State Archive in Nuremberg, where you can go and have a look through the fund of the Brandenburger Literalien, as they are called. And from this fund comes an amazing document, which doesn't look amazing. It's a list of tenants that belong to the estate with the sums of money that they were supposed to pay. This is the first detailed list of villages and names of people that we have for this area. And it is a wonder that survived. It was probably produced in 1510, immediately after he took over. And it is a list of Iobagiones living in 40 settlements in 3 districts, which are identified from other sources as being Districtus Volahales, Romanian districts, or Malachian, if you want, districts, as it were. Now, the area that belonged to the Hunyadi estate in Banat is this bit here. And we know this because the Ottoman administration preserved the late medieval borders. They did not bother with creating new administrative units. And you can see that the rest of Banat, which became part of the Ottoman province, expands on huge territories. The Nakhies, the administrative subdivisions are huge in terms of territory. These are tiny, and they're all concentrated in the very, very fertile valley of the river that runs through there. So what do we read in this list? 42 names of places, 199 names of people, of which 22 are collective names of people. They define people as collectivities, not as individuals. They are derived with the Romanian collective suffix ești. I will show you some examples very quickly. And there are 9 feminine anthroponyms. So we have the names of 9 women who appear in the record, which is amazing at this point, but they are very problematic. Now, these individuals, 100 bear a single name. They're identified with a single name formula. 68 individuals already have a double name. That is something that we can call a name and a surname, or a family name, as it were. And these appear in different orders. 40 have the order surname first and name then. 17 have the name first and the surname. And 3 are ambiguous. I couldn't decide in which order, because both components of the name could be either or. Now, the document is amazing because it reveals very much a lot of the bilingual and multilingual interactions in the area. It was put together very clearly by somebody who is used to writing in German, because most of the names are written with German orthographic solutions. He writes Stefan with double F, Matthias, Georg, Staniasa, Matiasonje with the conventions of the German orthography of the time. In some of the places, you can find isolated Hungarian words, such as for one of the village, the name of a guy is given, and then is fiai or fiai, the sons of. So this is one word that enters the record in Hungarian. There is also a family name derived clearly in Hungarian, Zilai, with a suffix, this E, which creates names of people from names of places, and which are then used as names of family. But there are also anthroponyms which are derived with very clearly recognizable South Slavic suffixes. We have individuals called Ratic or Radic, Bojic, Mikola, which clearly have names ending in each. The majority of the names, however, are Romanian in form. They have a Romanian form. Some of them have the definite masculine article ul or l at the end, like Danciul, Bonayancul. There are these collective names, Ștepănești, Trâpșești, Iacobești, which are clearly formed in Romanian. And these translate as all the members of the lineage called Stepănescu, or derived from a guy called Stepan. And then we have a regional feature, names derived with the suffix ony, which only exists now in Banat. It has disappeared from the rest of Romanian. Plus a Romanian diminutive suffix Ișor, from the name of a guy called George, the local version of George. Somebody created the name Giurgișor, Georgie, little George, as it were. And this made it into the written record. This made me ask, who put this list together, where you find all these languages interacting with each other in this absolutely fascinating way? And my solution for the moment is that it was put together centrally by the administrator of Georg von Brandenburg, from data either communicated by the communities themselves to him in various languages, or on the basis of what people who went there told him, and then he wrote it down, which is a very good indication of how many of these languages were interacting in the area at the time. Now, if you look at these names, the most remarkable ones are the feminine names. They have forms such as Rățăgoania, Măceșoane, Lăzăroania, Mircioania, Lucășoane, Lățcoane. And initially I was enthusiastic because finally we have women in the written records of the area, until I realized that these are not their names. These are their names insofar as they are the wife of or the widow of. Because these suffixes, this oanie, can still be used in the area to form names of women associated with the man. So about a woman called Mircioane, we can only know that she was the wife of a guy called Mircea, but we cannot know who she was, what language she spoke, what kind of identity she had. We don't even know her own name. The only thing we know is the way in which she was called. The same goes for this suffix iasă, which can form, again, feminine names from the names of the husband. From a guy's name, the guy is called Stan, his wife will be called Stăniasă, the wife of Stan. And that's how she appears in the record. We do not know what her name is at this point. Now, this is common at the time, because in other documents you can find very similar formulae that show you that this is indeed how Romanians living in Transylvania adopted a way of creating andronyms, names of wives derived from those of their husbands, which are probably inspired by Hungarian. And this is a clear sign that at least some of them were bilingual or had some degree of bilingualism between them. In an official document, a letter from 1608, we have a reference in Romanian, one of the few documents issued in Romanian in Transylvania at that time. We have a reference to a guy called Macrai István, and the mother of his honor, who is called Macrai Birtălăneasă. Now, this is obviously the wife of a guy called Macrai Birtalan, formed in Romanian with the help of the suffix iasă. And this simply translates the Hungarian formula Macrai Birtalane, with the suffix that can be added to form such names. And we see this in, sometimes people write in Hungarian and define themselves in this way from the name of their husbands. We find a very similar example in one of the very detailed accounts, maybe the most detailed account of expenses for the castle of Hunedoara, Hunyad, the center of the estate, that was sent to Georg von Brandenburg, where you have all kinds of sums of money per day for this and that and whatnot. And there a guy is mentioned called Jura or Jura. By his name, I would judge he's a local Romanian, but his wife is called Jurane, the wife of Jura, with the Hungarian suffix, but also the Latin word, which means his wife in front of it. So she's twice identified as his wife here, first with the Latin word and then with the suffix that creates her name in terms of dependence on it. So what can we deduce from this? Well, if for Mircea, I would argue her husband is probably a Romanian, given that he has such a Romanian sounding name. And for Stăniasă, there's very little other possibility of interpretation. For a woman who is called Istvăniasă, the possibilities increase because she is either the wife of an Istvan with the Romanian suffix that creates her name, or the wife of a guy called Istvan in Romanian, because we know that the name was used by local Romanians. We have derivatives from it, Istvănuț, Istvănoni, Istvănescu. So this is a name that can occur in other circumstances as well. You can see how difficult it becomes to assign very simply ethnic identity based on a name, on a simple name that appears in the record, if you don't look at it through the eyes of a linguist, as it were. I had selected way more material than I have time for today. So in order not to abuse your patience, I will use the very few remaining moments to give you a very brief introduction to the loanwords bit of my presentation, just a few of them. And then if you're curious about the curses bit at the very end, I'm more than happy to tell you something about that when we get to the question time. So the layered history of Banat that I was talking to you about can be seen in, for instance, words such as the word for to chat, which we used in the area, and which is specific to the area. It doesn't appear anywhere else in Romania. For to chat, we have the verb agiveni, which we share with the Serbian speakers across the border in Vojvodina. Also, that word only appears there, and with some Croatian varieties, where to have a chat is divanity. Now, this obviously goes back to an Ottoman word, the word for the public, the form of public debate, in the form of deliberation, the form where you make laws, the divan, where people gather and talk about this. And we know that this is so because there is a synonym in the area for agiveni, so to sit and chat. And this is asta la turvin, to sit at the turvin. This miraculous turvin is nothing other than the Hungarian word törvény, which means legislating assembly, the place where you make the law. So what you see here is first the Hungarian layer of the administration, which is kept especially in the southern parts of Banat, onto which you get the new layer, the Ottoman layer of the administration, which comes with its own words that are then borrowed in the local varieties. Not by chance, agiveni is found mostly in the central area that was part of the Ottoman Empire, whereas turvin survives mostly in this area that was not occupied until very, very late by by the Ottomans, and where the traditional structures, whose language at this point would have been Hungarian, were better preserved. Another example is the name for the person in charge of guarding the fields of the village. They asked this question in the 1970s. So this is data collected in the 1970s. Surprisingly, in Banat, most of the people called that person Gornik, which is an old Slavic word that used to be the name for somebody who guarded the field, and especially the forest. But in the central part of Banat, where you see these pink triangles, surprisingly, the respondents called the same person Subosh, which is nothing than the Ottoman term Subashi, a sort of police officer, which at this point ends up as the one who is in charge of the fields, basically. Remember, this is data collected in the 1970s. The Ottomans hadn't been there since 1716, yet the name lives on in a very coherent area here in the middle of the province. And if you want, I can tell you why exactly there. You see here on the map that area. Another, and this is one that Kati already knows because she has looked at this text. This is an amazing survival, because in Banat, the person to whom you pay money in order to be allowed to sell at the marketplace, so the officer in charge of collecting taxes for allowing you to sell at the marketplace, is called today, the tax itself is called armiție, which is nothing else than the Hungarian word harmincad, the 30th, tricesima, the name of a tax invented in the 13th century, introduced in the 13th century. The name lives on. I use it at home. So there's unbroken continuity, if you want, in specific circumstances. The word for tax, generally, mirrors very well the fact that the central part of Banat was liberated by the Habsburgs, and they became the masters to whom you pay tax. So there the tax is called Steuer, from the German word Steuer. In the mountainous part, however, remarkably, you remember that bit that wasn't occupied by the Ottomans. The tax on land is still called porție. Porție, remarkable because we know exactly when this particular tax was introduced. It was introduced at the end of the 17th century, specifically to finance the war of reconquest of Transylvania and these areas. And it survives here because this is the place which the Ottomans occupied the least, as it were, and where which was under the control of the Hungarian administration for the longest time. And a final example, and with this I will end. In Banat, we are very proud of the fact, and the peasants will tell you if you talk to them, that we never had masters. We never had boieri. This is the name for the landowner that is common in Moldavia and Wallachia. That's how the landowners are called there in uniform. We never had boieri, and we never had grofi. These are the blue squares in Transylvania, so you can clearly see. You see that the Banat stands apart in this area. How do we call the local landowners? How do we refer to the local landowners? You'll never guess. They are called spăie. The last landowners that the local linguistic memory remembers are the Ottoman Timarli Spahi. So the Spahis who were the landowners there. And the remarkable thing about it is that it's not only the Romanians who call them that, but even the Slavic-speaking Karashovans who were here from the 15th century, but even more remarkable, the Catholic Bulgarian who settled here in the 18th century call a landowner spăie. And this is not a word that they brought with them from Bulgaria. It's a word that they found here in what the people use, and they simply borrowed. And you would think inspired by all that you can read in traditional history books about how horrible the Ottomans were. These pagans who came and conquered and pillaged and raped and destroyed and taxed mercilessly, against whom the locals fought bravely, with whom they never interacted unless they had to pay taxes. They lived in completely separate universes. There was no communication, linguistic or otherwise, there, unless it was imposed by the brutal masters. Well, if you look at what spăie means in Banat, you will be very surprised, because the local landowner not only has penetrated the language itself, we have the masculine form for the man who owns the land, spăie, but there is a feminine derivative, spăioane, with the same oane suffix that we met before. And there is a proper name that's common only to the area, spaia, formerly spaia. And we have an expression, to live like at the court of the spahi. And this means that the way in which these landowners are remembered locally is a predominantly positive one. There is no negative connotation that attaches to any of these words. And this is indeed remarkable, because it gives the lie to this kind of official type of historiography that presupposes a culture of non-interaction or of violent interaction between these. Now, memories of this you can find if you dig into the language. You don't find them elsewhere. And the language itself does not lie, because it's very rare for a term like this to have radically changed its meaning and turned from this horrible, horrible, oppressive landlord into one of the best ways in which you can describe life back home.